Hello, and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight we'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers, or letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I'm honoured to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are we continents apart, or just a few time zones away, both listening as the stars come out? If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. What I'm about to reveal will shock you. The child chimney sweeps of industrial England weren't just doing a job. They were trapped in a system so horrific, so deliberately cruel, that it makes modern child labour laws seem like gentle suggestions. These weren't teenagers earning pocket money. We're talking about children as young as 4 years old, sold into what can only be described as legalized slavery. But here's what's really disturbing. This wasn't some underground criminal operation hidden from society. This was completely legal, widely accepted, and even celebrated as good business practice. The very people who should have protected these children were the ones profiting from their suffering. In this video, I'm going to take you inside the suffocating world of Britain's child chimney sweeps. You'll discover how thousands of children were systematically tortured, why society allowed it to continue for decades, and the shocking truth about what finally brought this nightmare to an end. I've spent weeks researching historical documents, parliamentary records, and first-hand accounts that most people have never seen. What I found will change how you think about childhood, about progress, and about how easily civilized society can turn a blind eye to unimaginable cruelty. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how bad this really was, because until you understand the full horror of what these children endured, you can't appreciate why this story matters so much today. Picture this. It's 1800, and you're 6 years old. Your parents are dead, or maybe they just can't afford to feed you anymore. Either way, you're standing in a workhouse, cold and hungry, when a man approaches. He's well-dressed, speaks kindly, and promises you food, shelter, and a trade that will serve you for life. Your guardians shake his hand, money changes hands, and suddenly you belong to him. You think you're being rescued. You have no idea you've just been sold into hell. Within hours, you're stripped naked and forced into a chimney flue so narrow you have to keep your arms pressed tight against your sides just to move. The walls scrape against your skin with every breath. The soot fills your mouth, your nose, your eyes. You can't see anything. You can't breathe properly. And when you try to back out, when the terror becomes too much and you start to panic, your new master lights a fire at the bottom of the chimney. That's right. They would literally light fires underneath terrified children to force them up chimneys. And this wasn't considered abuse. This was considered training. The children who survived their first week learned quickly. You climb fast. You scrape the soot with your bare hands. You ignore the cuts and bruises. And you never, ever show fear. Because showing fear meant harsher treatment. And harsher treatment meant you might not survive the next chimney. But here's the question that haunts me. How did an entire society convince itself this was acceptable? How did parents sell their children? How did homeowners hire these masters knowing what was happening? How did lawmakers write legislation that protected property rights but ignored screaming children trapped in their walls? The answer reveals something deeply disturbing about human nature, about economic systems, and about how easy it is to rationalize cruelty when it's profitable. Let me take you back to the beginning to understand how this horror story started. Because the child chimney sweeps weren't born from some sudden burst of evil. They were created by a perfect storm of technological change, economic desperation, and moral blindness that transformed innocent children into human tools. The story begins with the Great Fire of London in 1666. When the city rebuilt itself, architects and builders made a crucial decision that would doom thousands of children to lives of misery. They designed houses with narrow, twisting chimney flues that were impossible for adults to clean. These weren't straight vertical shafts. These were maze-like tunnels that bent at sharp angles, branched in multiple directions, and sometimes stretched for dozens of feet through the walls of grand mansions. Why build chimneys this way? Simple. It was cheaper. Narrow flues used less brick, took up less space, and allowed builders to cram more rooms into expensive city properties. Nobody thought about how these chimneys would be cleaned. That was somebody else's problem. And somebody else found a solution that was as brilliant as it was evil. If adult chimney sweeps couldn't fit through these narrow passages, why not use children instead? Children were small, flexible, and desperate. Children didn't demand wages. Children didn't have unions. Children didn't fight back. The first master sweeps who started using children weren't monsters, at least not in their own minds. They were entrepreneurs solving a market problem. London's growing middle class needed their chimneys cleaned, and traditional methods simply didn't work anymore. Child labour wasn't unusual in the 1700s Britain. Children worked in factories, in mines, on farms. Using them to clean chimneys seemed like a natural extension of existing practices. But there was something uniquely horrific about chimney work that separated it from other forms of child labour. Factory children might work 14-hour days, but they worked alongside other people, in rooms with windows, with breaks for meals. Mine children faced cave-ins and explosions, but they had co-workers, supervisors, and at least some basic safety protocols. Chimney children worked alone, in complete darkness, in spaces so confined they couldn't even turn around. When something went wrong, there was nobody to help them. When they got stuck, which happened constantly, they had to free themselves or suffocate. When they injured themselves on broken bricks or sharp metal, they had to keep working through the pain because stopping meant punishment. And the punishments were designed to be worse than the work itself. Masters would beat children with sticks, burn them with hot coals, or force them to sleep in cellars without food. Some masters would deliberately send children up chimneys they knew were still hot from recent fires, causing severe burns that would take weeks to heal. Others would refuse to let children wash, leaving them covered in soot for months at a time, which caused painful skin infections and made breathing even more difficult. The most sadistic masters developed elaborate torture techniques disguised as training methods. They would send children up practice chimneys filled with broken glass to toughen their skin. They would force children to climb chimneys while carrying heavy sacks of soot to build their strength. They would time children's climbs and beat those who weren't fast enough, even if the delay was caused by getting trapped or injured. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of the whole system was how it destroyed the children's sense of hope. These weren't temporary hardships that would end when the children grew up. The soot that constantly filled their lungs caused a disease called chimney sweeps cancer, which was almost always fatal. The repeated injuries to their knees and spines left many children permanently crippled. The malnutrition and abuse stunted their growth, both physically and mentally. Most chimney children didn't live to see their 20th birthday. Those who did survive were so damaged, physically and psychologically, that they couldn't transition to normal adult lives. They became the next generation of master sweeps, perpetuating the cycle of abuse because it was the only world they knew. And society knew this was happening. This wasn't some hidden crime taking place in secret. Chimney children worked in full view of homeowners, servants, and neighbours. Their coughing echoed through the walls of fine houses. Their soot-covered bodies emerged from fireplaces in front of entire families. Their screams when they got trapped could be heard throughout buildings. Yet somehow the adults who witnessed this suffering managed to convince themselves it wasn't their problem. They told themselves these children were better off working than starving in workhouses. They claimed the work was building character, teaching valuable skills, providing opportunities for advancement. They argued that interfering with the chimney sweep trade would destroy a vital industry and leave their own chimneys uncleaned. These problems. They donated money to orphanages, supported schools, weren't evil people in any obvious sense. They were ordinary for poor children, and advocated for various ways to look away. This psychological reforms. But when it came to the children's citizens, many of them religious, charitable, and genuinely concerned about social crawling through their own chimneys, they found blindness reveals something profound about how humans process moral responsibility. When cruelty is embedded in economic systems, when it's legally sanctioned and socially normalized, even good people can become complicit in horrors they would never commit individually. The homeowners hiring chimney sweeps weren't directly torturing children, so they could tell themselves they weren't responsible for the torture. The lawmakers weren't personally sending children up chimneys, so they could focus on other priorities. The general public wasn't profiting from the trade, so they could assume someone else would solve the problem. This diffusion of responsibility allowed the systematic abuse of children to continue for over a century, protected by a web of legal, economic, and social structures that made reform seem impossible. But what made the situation even more tragic was how preventable it all was. Alternative chimney cleaning methods existed throughout this period. Mechanical brushes, weighted ropes, and other tools could clean most chimneys effectively without using children at all. Some European countries had banned child chimney sweeps decades earlier and found perfectly adequate solutions. The reason Britain continued using children wasn't because there were no alternatives. It was because child labour was cheaper, faster, and more convenient than the alternatives. Masters could buy a child for a few pounds and work them for years without wages. Homeowners could hire child sweeps for a fraction of what adult cleaners charged. The economic incentives were all aligned to perpetuate the abuse. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire system. The masters who owned these children weren't just exploiting them for labour. They were systematically breaking down their humanity, piece by piece, until the children no longer saw themselves as deserving of basic dignity or care. The process began the moment a child entered a master's household. Their real names were often taken away and replaced with nicknames like Sooty, Blackbird, or Sweep. They were forbidden from speaking unless spoken to. They slept in cellars or attics, often on piles of soot-filled sacks that served as both bed and storage. They ate scraps, if they ate at all, and were denied basic hygiene that might have prevented the skin diseases that plagued their profession. But the psychological manipulation went far deeper than simple deprivation. Masters understood that broken children were compliant children. They would deliberately separate siblings sold together, ensuring that each child felt completely alone and dependent on their master's approval. They would pit children against each other, rewarding those who informed on escape attempts or signs of rebellion. They created an environment where survival depended on abandoning any sense of solidarity or hope. The daily routine was designed to crush the spirit as thoroughly as it destroyed the body. Children would wake before dawn, often sleeping in their work clothes because they owned nothing else. They would eat a meagre breakfast of bread crusts or thin porridge, then spend the day crawling through chimney after chimney, emerging only to move to the next house on their master's route. Between jobs, they weren't allowed to rest. Masters would force them to walk the streets calling out advertisements for their services, their small voices echoing through London's narrow alleys. "Sweep your chimney from the bottom to the top, without a ladder or a rope," they would chant, their words barely audible through throats raw from inhaling soot. The work itself became more dangerous as building techniques evolved. Victorian architects, obsessed with maximising living space, designed increasingly complex chimney systems that branched like underground rivers through the walls of their buildings. Some chimneys had horizontal sections that required children to crawl on their bellies for dozens of feet. Others had vertical drops that could seriously injure or kill a child who lost their grip. Getting stuck was every child's worst nightmare, and it happened with terrifying frequency. Picture being wedged in a space so tight you can't expand your chest to breathe properly, with rough brick scraping against your ribs every time you try to inhale. Your shoulders are jammed against the walls, Your knees are pressed into sharp mortar joints, and you can't move forward or backward. The soot in your mouth tastes like death, and the darkness is so complete you might as well be buried alive. When children got trapped, masters had several techniques for getting them out, none of them pleasant. The most common method was to drop a rope down from the top of the chimney and try to pull the child up by their arms, often dislocating shoulders or breaking bones in the process. If that failed, they might try pushing the child from below using long poles, treating them like stuck objects rather than terrified human beings. In the worst cases, when a child was wedged too tightly to be moved, masters would sometimes abandon them entirely. There are documented cases of children's skeletons being found in chimneys decades later, their small bones still positioned in the desperate poses they held while trying to free themselves. These weren't accidents. These were murders disguised as unfortunate business losses. The physical toll was devastating, but it accumulated slowly, making it easy for society to ignore. Children's growth was stunted by malnutrition and the constant compression of crawling through narrow spaces. Their spines curved into permanent hunches from years of moving in unnatural positions. Their knees developed thick calluses that eventually became open sores that never healed properly. Their hands told the most graphic story of their suffering. Constant contact with rough brick and sharp metal created deep cuts that filled with soot, causing infections that spread up their arms. Their fingernails were often torn completely off from scraping against chimney walls. Their palms developed layers of scar tissue so thick they could barely bend their fingers, but it was the respiratory damage that killed most of them. Every breath in a chimney filled their lungs with a mixture of soot, ash, and toxic chemicals from coal fires. This wasn't just dirt. This was a cocktail of carcinogens, heavy metals, and corrosive particles that gradually destroyed lung tissue and caused a specific form of cancer that became known as chimney sweep's cancer of the scrotum. The progression was predictable and horrific. Children would start with persistent coughs and shortness of breath. Their voices would become permanently hoarse from the constant irritation. They would develop painful sores on their skin, where soot mixed with sweat created a caustic paste. Eventually, cancerous tumors would begin growing in their respiratory and reproductive systems, causing agonizing deaths that could stretch on for months. Medical professionals of the time understood exactly what was happening. They had identified the connection between chimney work and cancer as early as 1775. They knew that proper protective equipment could prevent most of the damage. They knew that limiting children's exposure and providing proper medical care could save lives. Yet this knowledge changed nothing. Masters continued sending children up chimneys without protection because protective equipment was expensive and slowed down the work. Homeowners continued hiring child sweeps because they were cheaper than alternatives. Lawmakers continued ignoring the problem because chimney sweeps had no political power and generated significant tax revenue. The children themselves rarely lived long enough to become advocates for change. Those who survived to adulthood were often too damaged physically and psychologically to effectively challenge the system that, of their own worthlessness, that they accept, had destroyed them. They had been so thoroughly convinced their suffering as natural and inevitable. This learned helplessness was perhaps the master's greatest weapon. Children who might have rebelled against obvious cruelty instead submitted to systematic abuse because they had been taught that resistance was impossible and punishment was always their own fault. They internalized the belief that they deserved their suffering, that they were lucky to have work at all, and that any attempt to escape would only lead to worse treatment. The few children who did try to escape faced almost certain recapture. Masters had networks throughout London's criminal underworld that could track down runaways within days. Local magistrates routinely returned escaped children to their masters without investigating the reasons for their flight. Even sympathetic adults who wanted to help often had no legal means to intervene, since the indenture contracts gave masters complete control over their apprentices. This brings us to one of the most chilling aspects of the entire system. It wasn't sustained by evil masterminds or criminal organizations. It was sustained by ordinary people making rational economic decisions within a legal framework that treated children as property rather than human beings. The contracts that bound children to their masters were legally identical to contracts for apprenticeships in respectable trades. Parents or workhouse officials who signed these contracts believed they were providing opportunities for children to learn valuable skills. The language spoke of training, education, and eventual independence. Nothing in the paperwork mentioned torture, neglect, or early death. This legal facade allowed everyone involved to maintain plausible deniability about what was really happening. Masters could claim they were providing valuable services to society while training the next generation of skilled workers. Homeowners could insist they were supporting legitimate businesses and creating employment opportunities. Government officials could argue they were protecting property rights and maintaining economic stability. Meanwhile, children continued dying in chimneys at rates that would have sparked international outrage if they had occurred in any other context. But because these deaths happened individually, in private homes, to children who had no families or advocates, they generated no public attention or political pressure for change. The silence surrounding these deaths was deafening. When a child died in a chimney, their body would often remain undiscovered for days or even weeks. The smell of decomposition would eventually force homeowners to investigate. But by then, any evidence of how the child died had been obscured by time and decay. Masters would simply report the death as an accident, pay a small fine if any charges were brought at all, and immediately acquire a replacement child from the nearest workhouse. These weren't isolated incidents. Death records from London parishes show a consistent pattern of children aged 6 to 14 dying from what officials euphemistically called misadventure in chimneys. But the true scale of the carnage was hidden by how deaths were categorized. Children who died from chimney sweeps cancer were often listed as dying from consumption or wasting disease. Those who suffocated in flues were recorded as accidental deaths. Children who died from infected wounds or malnutrition were classified under various other causes that obscured their connection to the chimney trade. When researchers finally began tracking these deaths systematically in the 1830s, they discovered that child chimney sweeps had a mortality rate nearly 10 times higher than children in any other occupation, including coal mining and factory work. In some London districts, the average life expectancy for a chimney child was just 8 years after beginning work. But perhaps even more disturbing than the deaths were the living conditions that preceded them. Masters didn't just neglect their apprentices' health and safety. They actively created environments designed to maximize profit while minimizing costs, regardless of human suffering. Most master sweeps operated from cramped, filthy premises in London's poorest neighborhoods. A typical establishment might house 20 or 30 children in a single room with no windows, no proper sanitation, and barely enough space for each child to lie down. The floors were covered with layers of soot that had accumulated over years, creating a toxic dust that filled the air with every movement. Children slept on sacks stuffed with more soot, their only bedding often being the same clothes they worked in day after day. They weren't allowed to wash because masters claimed that clean skin was too soft for chimney work. The soot that covered their bodies acted as both armor and poison, protecting them from some cuts while slowly destroying their health from within. Meals were deliberately kept minimal to ensure children remained small enough to fit through the narrowest flues. A typical daily ration might consist of a piece of stale bread in the morning, thin soup with scraps of spoiled vegetables at midday, and perhaps another crust of bread in the evening. Many children supplemented this meagre diet by eating scraps they found while working, including bits of food that had fallen into fireplaces or garbage they discovered in the houses they cleaned. The psychological manipulation extended to every aspect of their daily lives. Masters understood that hungry, exhausted children were easier to control than those who retained any spark of defiance. They would deliberately pit children against each other for basic necessities, rewarding compliance with slightly larger food portions or marginally better sleeping spots. This created an atmosphere of competition and mistrust that prevented children from forming alliances that might lead to collective resistance. Language itself became a tool of oppression. Children were forbidden from using their real names and were instead assigned numbers or degrading nicknames that emphasized their function rather than their humanity. They weren't allowed to speak during meals, during work, or in the presence of customers. Many children went days at a time without hearing their own voice, creating a form of psychological isolation that was almost as damaging as the physical abuse. The work schedule was designed to break down any sense of normalcy or hope for the future. Children would begin work before dawn and continue until well after sunset, 7 days a week, regardless of weather or their physical condition. There were no holidays, no rest days, no acknowledgement of birthdays or seasons. Time became an endless cycle of climbing, scraping, coughing, and sleeping, with no variation to mark progress or suggest that conditions might ever improve. Masters developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for extracting maximum productivity from their child workforce. They would map out routes through the city that allowed them to clean dozens of chimneys per day, timing each job to minimize travel time between houses. Children were expected to memorize these routes and navigate independently from house to house, carrying their own equipment and collecting payment from customers. The equipment itself tells a horrifying story of how thoroughly society had adapted to using children as tools. Special brushes were designed in child-sized versions. Ropes and pulleys were calibrated for the weight of small bodies. Even the soot bags that children carried were sized to be manageable by hands that should have been holding toys instead of tools of their own exploitation. But it was the customers' reactions that revealed how completely normalized this horror had become. Wealthy homeowners would casually discuss the merits of different master sweeps the same way they might compare butchers or tailors. They would compliment masters whose children worked quickly and quietly, without considering what methods might be used to achieve such efficiency. Servants in grand houses learned to time their daily routines around the chimney cleanings, treating the appearance of soot-covered children as just another household maintenance task. They would clear valuable items from mantelpieces, cover furniture with old sheets, and open windows to air out the rooms afterward, all while ignoring the human suffering unfolding literally within their walls. Some homeowners even developed preferences for particular children, requesting the same young sweeps for return visits because they had learned the specific layout of their chimneys. These requests were treated as customer service, with masters proudly advertising their children's specialized knowledge of different chimney systems. The idea that these children might have feelings about being passed around like specialized equipment never seemed to occur to anyone involved. The seasonal nature of the work created its own form of cruelty. Winter months, when fires burned constantly and chimneys needed frequent cleaning, meant 14-hour workdays in conditions that were already barely survivable. Summer brought different torments, as masters would use the slower season to send children up chimneys that were still warm from recent fires, claiming this was necessary training for the busy season ahead. Weather became another enemy. Rain turned chimney soot into a corrosive paste that burned exposed skin and made climbing surfaces slippery and treacherous. Snow and ice created conditions where children's hands would freeze to metal fixtures inside chimneys, requiring them to tear their skin free or risk being trapped until their fingers went numb and they lost their grip entirely. The tools of the trade evolved to become more efficient at extracting work from small bodies. Masters developed increasingly sophisticated punishment devices disguised as training equipment. Special brushes with embedded glass or metal fragments were used to toughen children's skin. Weighted belts were designed to make climbing more difficult, supposedly building strength but actually increasing the risk of falls and injuries. Some masters created elaborate systems of rewards and punishments that turned basic human needs into privileges that had to be earned through compliance. A child who cleaned chimneys quickly might be allowed to wash their face once a week. Those who showed any sign of rebellion might be denied food for days or forced to sleep outside in winter weather. The apprenticeship contracts that legally bound these children contained clauses that essentially gave masters unlimited power over every aspect of their lives. Masters could relocate children anywhere in the country without notice. They could loan children to other masters for weeks or months at a time. They could sell a child's contract to another master without the child's knowledge or consent. These contracts typically lasted until the child reached adulthood, but the definition of adulthood was deliberately vague. Some contracts specified age 18, others mentioned age 21, and many simply stated that the apprenticeship would continue until the child was no longer suited for the work. Since most children died or became too injured to work long before reaching legal adulthood, this final clause effectively meant lifelong bondage. The few children who did survive to the end of their contracts faced a cruel irony. After years of having their growth stunted and their education neglected, they were released into a world where they had no skills except chimney sweeping, no social connections except other members of the trade, and no resources to build independent lives. Most became masters themselves, perpetuating the cycle of abuse because it was the only economic opportunity available to them. This created a self-reinforcing system where each generation of survivors became the next generation of perpetrators. The masters who were most successful at breaking children's spirits and maximizing their productivity were the ones who prospered economically and expanded their operations. Those who showed any compassion or provided better conditions found themselves at a competitive disadvantage and were gradually driven out of business. The geographic expansion of this system reveals how thoroughly it had infected British society. What began as a London phenomenon spread throughout England as industrialisation created new cities filled with narrow chimney houses that required child labour to maintain. Master sweeps established operations in Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, and dozens of smaller industrial towns, each creating their own networks of child procurement and exploitation. Different regions developed their own variations on the basic system, but all shared the same fundamental structure of adult profit built on child suffering. Northern industrial cities, with their coal-burning factories creating additional demand for chimney cleaning, often worked children even longer hours than their London counterparts. Rural areas, where supervision was even more limited than in cities, sometimes saw levels of abuse that shocked even hardened urban masters. The transportation of children between regions created additional opportunities for cruelty. Masters would buy children in areas where poverty made them cheap and plentiful, then transport them to regions where demand for chimney sweeps was high. These journeys, often lasting days or weeks, were conducted with children chained together like prisoners, sleeping rough and eating whatever scraps their captors provide. The conditions during these forced marches revealed yet another layer of calculated cruelty in the chimney sweep system. Masters would deliberately time these journeys to coincide with market days in towns along the route, parading their soot-covered children through crowded streets as living advertisements for their services. The children, already weakened by malnutrition and exhaustion, were forced to call out their masters' prices while struggling to keep pace with the group. These public displays served a dual purpose that was as psychologically devastating as it was economically motivated. While masters gained new customers impressed by their apparent productivity, the children experienced a form of public humiliation that reinforced their status as property rather than human beings. Townspeople would examine them like livestock, commenting on their size, apparent health, and suitability for different types of chimney work. The most disturbing aspect of these regional expansions was how quickly local communities adapted to the presence of child sweeps. Within months of masters establishing operations in new areas, Residents would begin structuring their daily routines around the assumption that small children would be available to crawl through their walls. This rapid normalization suggests something deeply troubling about human nature's capacity to accept suffering when it provides convenience and economic benefit. Local magistrates and officials, who might have been expected to question the sudden appearance of obviously abused children in their jurisdictions, instead focused on the business licenses and tax revenues that masters represented. The legal framework that had evolved in London to legitimize child exploitation was quickly replicated in every region where the trade took root. But the expansion also revealed the true scale of demand for this horrific form of labour. By the 1820s, estimates suggest that over 10,000 children were working as chimney sweeps across Britain. This wasn't a small localised problem affecting a few unfortunate individuals. This was a massive, systematic exploitation of children that had become integral to the functioning of British society. The sheer numbers involved made individual stories of suffering easier to ignore, while simultaneously making the overall problem seem too large to address. When people encountered a single abused child, they might feel compelled to help. When confronted with thousands of such children spread across an entire nation, the same people often felt overwhelmed and helpless, leading to the psychological defense mechanism of simply looking away. This psychological phenomenon became one of the most powerful forces protecting the chimney sweep trade from reform efforts. Well-meaning individuals who genuinely cared about child welfare found themselves paralysed by the magnitude of the problem. They would donate to orphanages or support educational charities, telling themselves they were addressing child poverty, while carefully avoiding direct confrontation with the systematic torture happening in their own neighbourhoods. The children themselves began developing their own underground networks of communication and survival strategies. Despite masters' efforts to prevent solidarity, children working in the same regions would find ways to share information about particularly dangerous chimneys, cruel homeowners, and masters who might offer marginally better treatment. These informal networks operated through a complex system of signals and codes that children could communicate even under the watchful eyes of their masters. A particular way of arranging soot bags might indicate that a certain house had sharp metal fixtures that caused severe cuts. A specific coughing pattern could warn other children about chimneys with poor ventilation that increased the risk of suffocation. The most experienced children, those who had somehow survived long enough to develop expertise, became unofficial mentors to newcomers. They would teach survival techniques, like how to position your body to minimize cuts from rough brick, which types of soot indicated recently used fireplaces that might still be dangerously hot, and how to recognize the early warning signs of becoming trapped in a narrowing flue. But even these survival networks couldn't address the fundamental horror of the work itself. The daily routine of crawling through chimneys remained a form of torture that no amount of preparation or technique could make truly bearable. Children might learn to minimize some injuries, but they couldn't avoid the constant incomplete darkness, or the ever-present fear respiratory damage, the psychological trauma of becoming trapped and dying alone in the walls of a stranger's house. The chimney systems themselves were becoming increasingly complex and dangerous as architectural fashions evolved. Georgian and early Victorian builders, competing to create more impressive and space-efficient designs, began incorporating multiple flues that intersected at odd angles, creating maze-like passages that even experienced adult sweeps couldn't navigate safely. Some of these newer chimneys featured horizontal sections that stretched for 20 or 30 feet through walls, requiring children to crawl on their bellies while pushing cleaning equipment ahead of them. Others had vertical drops that connected different levels of flue systems, creating deadly traps where a child who lost their grip could fall dozens of feet onto hard brick or metal fixtures. The most nightmarish designs included what builders called return flues, which doubled back on themselves in tight S-curves that allowed smoke to travel efficiently, but created spaces where children could become wedged so tightly that extraction became nearly impossible. Masters learned to identify these particularly dangerous chimneys and would sometimes charge premium rates for cleaning them, treating the increased risk to children as a business opportunity rather than a moral concern. The technical challenges posed by these complex chimney systems led to increasingly sophisticated forms of child abuse, disguised as professional training. Masters developed specialized techniques for forcing children through impossibly narrow spaces, including methods for temporarily dislocating children's shoulders to allow passage through tight spots, then snapping the joints back into place once the child had moved through the obstruction. Some masters became experts in what they called chimney navigation, teaching children to memorize the internal layout of complex flue systems by forcing them to climb the same dangerous passages repeatedly until they could move through them quickly, even in complete darkness. This training process often involved deliberately trapping children in difficult positions until they developed the flexibility and problem-solving skills needed to free themselves. The tools used in these training sessions revealed the calculated nature of the cruelty involved. Masters would insert wooden blocks or metal barriers into practice chimneys, creating artificial obstacles that children had to navigate around or remove while climbing. These obstacles would be gradually made smaller and more difficult to manipulate, forcing children to develop increasingly unnatural body positions and movements. Children who showed particular aptitude for navigating complex chimneys became valuable assets who could be rented out to other masters for premium fees. These specialist children often faced even worse treatment than their peers, as their increased economic value led masters to push them harder and take greater risks with their safety. The rental system that developed around skilled child sweeps created another layer of horror within an already nightmarish trade. Children could be loaned out for weeks or months at a time to masters in distant cities, completely cutting them off from any familiar faces or environments. During these rentals, they had no protection whatsoever from abuse, as their temporary masters had no long-term investment in their survival or health. The financial arrangements surrounding child rentals were particularly revealing of how thoroughly the system had commodified human beings. Masters would negotiate fees based on the child's size, experience level, and expected lifespan, with younger children commanding higher prices due to their ability to fit through narrower spaces, while older children were discounted because they were closer to becoming too large for the work. These business negotiations took place in plain sight of the children being discussed, who were forced to listen as adults debated their monetary value and suitability for different types of dangerous work. The psychological impact of being openly treated as merchandise was devastating, reinforcing the children's internalized belief that they existed solely to generate profit for others. The record-keeping associated with child rentals provides some of the most chilling documentary evidence of how the system operated. Masters maintained detailed ledgers tracking which children were most profitable, noting factors like speed of chimney cleaning, frequency of injuries that interrupted work, and customer satisfaction ratings based on how quietly and efficiently children completed their tasks. These business records, preserved in various archives, read like livestock inventories rather than employment documents. Children are listed alongside equipment purchases, maintenance costs, and revenue projections. Their deaths are recorded in the same matter-of-fact tone used for noting broken tools or expired business licenses. The seasonal patterns revealed in these ledgers show how masters planned their operations around the natural life cycle of child exploitation. They would typically acquire new children in late summer or early fall, allowing several months for basic training before the busy winter season began. Spring often brought a culling process where children who had become too injured or sick to work effectively would be abandoned or sold to less profitable masters who children. The regional variations in these specialized in extracting final value from damaged business practices reflected local economic conditions and cultural attitudes toward child welfare. Areas with stronger religious influences sometimes saw masters adopting more elaborate justifications for their treatment of children, claiming that hard work and suffering were building character and preparing children for productive adult lives. Industrial regions, where child labour in factories and mines had already normalised the exploitation of young workers, often witnessed even more extreme forms of abuse as masters competed to demonstrate their commitment to maximum productivity. The presence of other forms of dangerous child labour created a perverse form of moral relativism where chimney work was justified as being no worse than available alternatives. Rural areas presented their own unique challenges and opportunities for exploitation. The scattered nature of houses requiring chimney cleaning meant that children often worked in complete isolation with no witnesses to observe or report abuse. Masters could transport children between remote properties with no oversight whatsoever, creating opportunities for levels of cruelty that would have attracted attention in more populated areas. The transportation infrastructure of early industrial Britain inadvertently facilitated the expansion of child exploitation networks. New turnpike roads and canal systems, built to support legitimate commerce, also provided masters with efficient means of moving children between regions where demand for their services was highest. These improved transportation networks allowed masters to develop increasingly sophisticated business models based on seasonal migration patterns. They could maintain permanent operations in major cities while also sending teams of children to work rural areas during harvest seasons when farmers had extra income to spend on household maintenance. The logistics of managing mobile child labour forces required masters to develop new forms of control and surveillance. Children working far from their home bases were at greater risk of escape attempts, leading masters to implement increasingly harsh preventive measures, including physical restraints, closer supervision, and more severe punishments for any sign of defiance. The isolation experienced by children working in remote areas was particularly devastating to their psychological well-being. Already cut off from normal human relationships by their enslavement, they found themselves working in locations where they might not encounter another child for weeks at a time. This extreme social isolation accelerated the process of psychological breakdown that was already inherent in their circumstances. The working conditions in rural areas often involved additional hazards not present in urban environments. Country houses, built with local materials and techniques, sometimes featured chimneys with irregular internal structures that created unique dangers. Stone chimneys in particular could have sharp projections or crumbling mortar that caused severe lacerations, while timber-lined flues in older buildings might contain splinters or exposed nails that could inflict deep puncture wounds. Weather conditions also posed greater challenges in rural settings. Country houses were often exposed to stronger winds and more extreme temperature variations than urban buildings, creating situations where children might find themselves trapped in chimneys during severe storms or temperature swings that could cause dangerous expansion or contraction of the flue structures. The medical care available to injured children in rural areas was often even more limited than what they might receive in cities. Country doctors, when they could be found at all, frequently had little experience treating the specific types of injuries and illnesses associated with chimney work. Many rural practitioners had never encountered chimney sweep's cancer or the respiratory diseases caused by constant soot inhalation. This lack of medical knowledge meant that children suffering from work-related illnesses often received inappropriate or harmful treatments that worsened their conditions. Some rural doctors, unfamiliar with the connection between chimney work and certain types of cancer, would prescribe treatments that actually accelerated the progression of the disease. The geographic isolation of rural chimney work also meant that deaths could go unnoticed for extended periods. When children died while working in remote locations, their bodies might not be discovered until other sweeps arrived to continue the work days or weeks later. This delay in discovery often made it impossible to determine the exact cause of death, allowing masters to avoid accountability for obvious cases of fatal neglect or abuse. The documentation of rural child deaths was often even more inadequate than urban record keeping. Local parish registers in remote areas might not accurately record the occupations of deceased children. making it difficult for later researchers to track the true mortality rates associated with chimney work in different regions. These gaps in documentation served the interests of masters and government officials who preferred to minimize public awareness of the scale of child mortality in the chimney trade. By maintaining operations in areas where deaths were less likely to be properly recorded or investigated, masters could continue their practices with reduced risk of legal consequences or public scrutiny. The expansion of chimney sweep operations into rural areas also created new opportunities for the procurement of children from isolated farming communities struggling with economic hardship. Rural poverty often left families even more desperate than their urban counterparts, making them willing to accept masters' promises of apprenticeships and opportunities for their children without asking too many questions about the specific nature of the work involved. The agricultural cycle created predictable periods when rural families were most vulnerable to masters' recruitment efforts. Late winter and early spring, when food stores were running low and the previous year's harvest income had been exhausted, were prime seasons for acquiring children from families who could no longer afford to feed them. Masters developed sophisticated understanding of rural economic patterns, timing their recruitment visits to coincide with periods of maximum desperation. They would arrive in farming communities just as families were facing the prospect of starvation, presenting themselves as providential solutions to immediate crises. The isolation of rural communities also meant that families had fewer opportunities to learn about the true nature of chimney work, or to hear cautionary tales from other parents who had lost children to the trade. Urban families might encounter former chimney sweeps or hear gossip about the dangers of the profession, but rural families often had no access to such information. This information asymmetry allowed masters to maintain elaborate deceptions about the working conditions and life prospects of children in their care. They could present carefully crafted stories about successful former apprentices who had established their own businesses, without mentioning the vastly larger number who had died young or been permanently disabled by their work. The religious and cultural contexts of rural communities sometimes provided masters with additional tools for manipulation. In areas where hard work and suffering were viewed as character-building virtues, masters could frame their treatment of children as moral education rather than exploitation. Some masters became skilled at adopting the language and mannerisms of local religious traditions, presenting themselves as godly men who were providing moral guidance alongside practical training. They would quote scripture about the value of hard work and the importance of accepting one's station in life, using religious authority to justify practices that would otherwise be recognized as obviously cruel. The seasonal nature of rural chimney work created its own rhythm of suffering that differed from the constant grind experienced by urban children. Rural children might face periods of relative inactivity during summer months, but these apparent respites were often filled with other forms of abuse or preparation for the intense work periods that would follow. Masters used these slower seasons to implement harsh conditioning programs, designed to prepare children for the upcoming busy period. Children might be forced to practice climbing in artificially heated practice chimneys, or subjected to deliberate starvation to ensure they remained small enough to fit through the narrowest flues. The cyclical nature of rural work also meant that children experienced repeated cycles of hope and despair as quiet periods gave way to intense work seasons. This psychological pattern of alternating relief and renewed suffering was particularly damaging to children's mental health, preventing them from developing stable coping mechanisms or maintaining hope for eventual improvement in their circumstances. The integration of chimney sweep operations with other seasonal labour markets created additional opportunities for exploitation. Masters would sometimes loan children to farmers during harvest seasons, presenting this as beneficial diversification while actually subjecting children to multiple forms of dangerous labour within the same year. These cross-seasonal arrangements often involved children in agricultural work that was nearly as dangerous as chimney cleaning, including tasks like climbing into grain silos to clear blockages, or working with threshing equipment that could cause severe injuries. The combination of chimney work and agricultural labour created a year-round cycle of exploitation that gave children no opportunity for recovery or normal development. The rural expansion of the chimney sweep trade also facilitated the development of more sophisticated networks for trafficking children between regions. Masters established relationships with rural workhouses, orphanages, and individual families that allowed them to maintain steady supplies of replacement children as their existing workforce was depleted by death and disability. These procurement networks operated with a level of organization and efficiency that would have been impressive in legitimate businesses. Masters maintained detailed knowledge of economic conditions in dozens of rural communities, allowing them to predict when and where children would become available for acquisition. The systematic nature of these child procurement operations reveals the industrial scale that the chimney sweep trade had achieved by the early 19th century. This wasn't a collection of individual craftsmen taking on apprentices. This was a coordinated industry built on the systematic exploitation of children, with supply chains, distribution networks, and market analysis that would have been familiar to any other business sector of the period. The sophistication of these child trafficking networks extended far beyond simple procurement operations. Masters developed elaborate intelligence systems that tracked economic conditions, family circumstances, and local authorities across vast geographical areas. They maintained contacts in workhouses who would alert them when particularly vulnerable children became available. They cultivated relationships with parish officials who could expedite the legal paperwork needed to transfer custody of orphaned or abandoned children. These networks operated with a level of coordination that rivaled legitimate commercial enterprises of the era. Masters would share information about profitable routes, reliable sources of children, and effective techniques for breaking resistance. They established informal, territorial agreements that prevented direct competition while maximizing overall industry profits. Some even developed primitive insurance arrangements where masters would compensate each other for children lost to accidents or disease. The financial infrastructure supporting these operations was equally sophisticated. Masters maintained complex accounting systems that tracked not just immediate profits and expenses, but long-term projections based on expected child mortality rates, seasonal demand fluctuations, and regional market conditions. They calculated the optimal age at which to acquire children, balancing the higher initial cost of younger children against their longer potential working life and greater ability to navigate narrow chimneys. These calculations were performed with the same cold precision that other businesses might use to evaluate livestock or machinery. Children were assessed based on measurable characteristics like height, weight, flexibility, and apparent health, with masters developing standardized evaluation criteria that allowed them to quickly assess the potential value of prospective acquisitions. The most successful masters began establishing what could only be described as breeding programs, identifying former chimney sweeps who had survived to adulthood and encouraging them to produce children who could be recruited into the trade. These arrangements were often disguised as marriages or apprenticeships, but the underlying purpose was to create a steady supply of children who were already conditioned to accept the harsh realities of chimney work. The children produced through these arrangements faced even worse circumstances than those acquired through traditional procurement methods. Born into the trade, they never experienced any alternative way of life that might give them hope for escape or improvement. They were raised from infancy to view suffering as normal and to consider themselves fortunate to have any role in society at all. The psychological conditioning of these second-generation chimney children was particularly thorough and devastating. Having never known kindness, adequate food, or basic human dignity, they lacked even the memory of better circumstances that might motivate resistance. They became perfect victims, completely compliant, and utterly without hope. Masters used these perfectly conditioned children as training tools for newly acquired children, demonstrating that complete submission was not only possible, but normal. New children who witnessed the absolute compliance of their peers quickly learned that resistance was futile and that their only choice was between submission and death. The technical innovations developed by the chimney sweep industry during this period reveal the systematic nature of the exploitation and the lengths to which masters would go to maximize profits from child labor. Masters began collaborating with architects and builders to design chimney systems that were optimized for child access while maintaining efficiency for smoke removal. These collaborations produced increasingly sophisticated flue designs that incorporated features specifically intended to facilitate child navigation. Some new chimneys included small platforms or handholds positioned at intervals that allowed children to rest during long climbs. Others featured wider sections at key points that provided space for children to turn around if they encountered obstacles. While these innovations might appear to represent improvements in working conditions, they actually enabled masters to send children into even more complex and dangerous chimney systems. The apparent safety features were designed not to protect children, but to allow them to survive long enough to clean chimneys that would have been impossible to navigate under previous designs. The most sinister aspect of these architectural collaborations was how they normalized the use of child labor in chimney design. Builders began assuming that small children would be available for maintenance when they designed new structures, creating chimneys that could only be cleaned by human beings small enough to crawl through spaces barely wider than their own bodies. This design philosophy spread throughout British architecture, creating thousands of buildings that were literally dependent on child exploitation for basic maintenance. Homeowners who purchased these properties found themselves with no choice but to hire child sweeps, as no alternative cleaning methods could access the deliberately narrow flue systems. The integration of child labor requirements into architectural design created a form of structural dependency that made reform efforts even more difficult to implement. Any attempt to ban child chimney sweeps would render thousands of buildings unmaintainable, creating powerful economic incentives for property owners to oppose regulatory changes. Masters exploited this architectural dependency by positioning themselves as essential service providers rather than child abusers. They argued that they were meeting legitimate market demands created by building designs, deflecting moral responsibility onto architects and property owners who had created the conditions requiring their services. This deflection of responsibility became a central strategy for defending the chimney sweep trade against growing criticism. Masters presented themselves as skilled professionals solving technical problems, while portraying their critics as naive idealists who didn't understand the practical realities of maintaining complex chimney systems. The professional associations that masters began forming during this period served multiple purposes beyond simple trade organization. These groups worked to establish standardized practices that would legitimize child exploitation while preventing competition that might improve conditions or increase costs. The associations developed elaborate codes of conduct that appeared to regulate the treatment of child apprentices while actually codifying and protecting abusive practices. These codes specified minimum food rations, maximum working hours, and basic safety procedures, but the standards were set so low that compliance still permitted systematic torture and neglect. More importantly, the associations created mechanisms for policing members who might be tempted to improve conditions for their children. Masters who provided better food, shorter working hours, or safer equipment found themselves ostracized from the professional community and excluded from the most profitable contracts. The standardization of abusive practices through professional codes served to normalize cruelty by presenting it as technical expertise rather than moral failure. Masters could point to their adherence to industry standards as evidence of their professionalism, while critics found themselves arguing against practices that had been legitimized by apparent expert consensus. The associations also served as powerful lobbying organizations that worked to prevent legislative reforms that might threaten the industry's access to child labor. They hired lawyers, funded political campaigns, and produced propaganda that portrayed child chimney sweeps as beneficiaries of valuable educational opportunities rather than victims of systematic abuse. The legal strategies developed by these professional associations were particularly sophisticated and effective. Rather than defending child exploitation directly, they focused on property rights, economic necessity, and the dangers of government interference with legitimate business practices. These legal arguments proved remarkably successful at preventing meaningful reform for decades. Courts consistently ruled that private contracts between masters and child apprentices were beyond government regulation, even when the contracts explicitly authorized practices that would have been considered criminal if applied to adults. The property rights arguments were equally effective at blocking reform efforts. Masters successfully argued that homeowners had fundamental rights to maintain their property using whatever methods were most effective, and that government interference with chimney cleaning practices represented an unacceptable violation of private property rights. The economic necessity arguments played on widespread fears about the potential costs of regulatory changes. Industry representatives claimed that banning child chimney sweeps would require expensive modifications to thousands of buildings, creating financial hardships for property owners and potentially rendering some structures completely unusable. These cost projections were almost certainly exaggerated, but they proved effective at generating opposition to reform among property owners who might otherwise have supported improvements in working conditions for children. The industry successfully framed the debate as a choice between child welfare and economic catastrophe, making compromise positions seem reasonable even when they perpetuated systematic abuse. The propaganda campaigns developed by the chimney sweep industry were among the most sophisticated public relations efforts of the early industrial period. Masters hired writers, artists, and speakers to create compelling narratives that portrayed their industry in positive terms while discrediting their critics. These campaigns emphasized themes of opportunity, education, and social mobility, presenting chimney work as a pathway for disadvantaged children to acquire valuable skills and establish themselves in respectable trades. They highlighted the few children who had survived to become successful masters themselves, while ignoring the thousands who had died young or been permanently disabled. The propaganda also played on class tensions and social anxieties, suggesting that critics of the chimney sweep trade were wealthy elitists who were out of touch with the practical needs of working families. This messaging proved particularly effective at dividing potential reform coalitions and preventing the emergence of unified opposition to child exploitation. Perhaps most cynically, the industry propaganda campaigns appropriated religious and moral language to justify practices that were fundamentally immoral. Masters presented themselves as charitable figures who were rescuing children from starvation and providing them with purpose and direction in life. This religious framing proved especially effective in communities where traditional Christian values emphasized hard work, acceptance of suffering, and respect for authority. Masters could present their treatment of children as moral education that was preparing them for productive adult lives while building their character through adversity. The success of these propaganda efforts reveals something disturbing about how easily public opinion can be manipulated when economic interests align with effective messaging strategies. Even people who witnessed the obvious suffering of chimney children could be convinced that this suffering was actually beneficial to the children themselves. The institutional support that the chimney sweep industry received from government agencies, religious organizations, and educational institutions demonstrates how thoroughly the exploitation had been integrated into the fabric of British society. Government officials routinely cited the industry's contributions to tax revenues and employment when defending policies that protected child exploitation. Religious leaders frequently praised masters for providing moral guidance to children who might otherwise turn to crime or vice. Educational reformers argued that chimney work provided practical training that was more valuable than formal schooling for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. These institutional endorsements created powerful barriers to reform by lending moral and intellectual authority to practices that were obviously cruel and exploitative. Critics found themselves arguing not just against economic interests, but against the combined authority of government, church, and educational establishments. The medical establishment's complicity in legitimizing child exploitation was particularly damaging to reform efforts. Despite clear evidence linking chimney work to specific diseases and high mortality rates, many doctors continued to support the industry by providing medical justifications for practices that were obviously harmful to children's health. Some physicians argued that the physical conditioning required for chimney work actually strengthened children's bodies and prepared them for other forms of manual labor. Others claimed that the respiratory problems associated with soot inhalation were temporary conditions that would resolve once children's bodies adapted to their working environment. These medical opinions were not based on rigorous scientific analysis, but they provided industry defenders with apparently authoritative support for their positions. Reform advocates found themselves arguing against medical professionals who claimed specialized knowledge about the health effects of chimney work. The few doctors who did speak out against the industry faced professional ostracism and economic retaliation. The medical establishment's commitment to protecting its own interests proved stronger than its dedication to protecting children's health, creating another institutional barrier to meaningful reform. The educational theories that emerged to justify child chimney sweeps reveal how intellectual frameworks can be distorted to serve economic interests. Educators argued that practical experience was more valuable than formal schooling for children from poor families, and that chimney work provided exactly the kind of hands-on training that would prepare them for productive adult lives. These educational arguments were particularly effective because they appeared to address legitimate concerns about the relevance and accessibility of formal education for disadvantaged children. Reform critics could present themselves as educational progressives who were advocating for practical training over abstract academic learning. The reality, of course, was that chimney work provided no transferable skills and left children too damaged physically and psychologically to pursue any other form of employment. But the educational rhetoric provided a respectable intellectual framework for defending practices that serve no purpose except generating profits from child suffering. The international context of British child exploitation reveals how the chimney sweep industry was both unique and representative of broader patterns in early industrial development. While other European countries had banned or severely restricted the use of child chimney sweeps, Britain's more aggressive pursuit of industrial expansion created greater tolerance for exploitative practices. This international isolation should have created pressure for reform, as British practices became increasingly out of step with evolving standards in other developed nations. Instead, industry defenders used Britain's economic success as evidence that their methods were superior to the supposedly softer approaches adopted elsewhere. The contrast with other countries became a source of national pride rather than shame, with British commentators arguing that their willingness to make hard choices about child welfare demonstrated superior commitment to economic progress and practical problem-solving. This nationalistic framing of child exploitation made reform efforts appear unpatriotic, creating additional barriers to meaningful change. Critics found themselves accused of undermining British competitiveness and adopting foreign ideas that were unsuited to British conditions and values. The technological developments that were beginning to emerge during this period offered clear alternatives to child labour in chimney cleaning, but the industry successfully resisted adoption of these innovations for decades. Mechanical brushes, flexible rods, and other tools could clean most chimneys effectively without requiring human access to narrow flues. The resistance to technological solutions reveals that the continued use of child labour was driven by economic considerations rather than technical necessity. Children were simply cheaper and more convenient than mechanical alternatives, even when those alternatives were readily available. Masters argued that mechanical cleaning methods were less thorough than human cleaning, but this claim was demonstrably false in most cases. The real issue was that mechanical methods required initial capital investments and ongoing maintenance costs that reduced short-term profits compared to the essentially free labour provided by owned children. The slow adoption of cleaning technologies also reflected the industry's investment in existing systems of child procurement and management. Masters who had spent years developing networks for acquiring and controlling children were reluctant to abandon these investments in favor of technological solutions that would eliminate their competitive advantages. The resistance to technological innovation created a perverse situation where obvious solutions to humanitarian problems were actively suppressed in favor of maintaining profitable systems of exploitation. This pattern would be repeated in other industries and other contexts, revealing how economic interests can prevent adoption of improvements that would benefit society as a whole. The cultural representations of chimney sweeps in literature, art, and popular entertainment of the period provide insight into how society processed the moral contradictions inherent in systematic child exploitation. Rather than confronting the reality of suffering and death, popular culture created sanitized versions of chimney work that emphasized picturesque or sentimental aspects while ignoring the brutal realities. Children's books featured cheerful chimney sweeps who sang while they worked and were grateful for the opportunities their profession provided. Popular songs celebrated the hard work and determination of young sweeps without mentioning their high mortality rates or the systematic abuse they endured. These cultural representations served important psychological functions for a society that was simultaneously dependent on and disturbed by child exploitation. By creating fictional versions of chimney sweeps who were happy and healthy, popular culture allowed people to maintain their economic relationships with the industry while avoiding confrontation with its moral implications. The gap between cultural representations and lived reality was so extreme as to constitute a form of collective delusion. The cheerful, singing chimney sweeps of popular imagination bore no resemblance whatsoever to the traumatized, dying children who actually performed the work. This cultural mythology became self-reinforcing as each generation grew up with romanticized images of chimney work that made the reality even more difficult to acknowledge. Children who read stories about happy chimney sweeps found it harder to recognize abuse when they encountered real chimney children, while adults could point to cultural representations as evidence that their society was fundamentally moral and caring. The persistence of these mythological representations, long after the abolition of child chimney sweeps, reveals how powerful cultural narratives can be in shaping collective memory and preventing honest acknowledgement of historical injustices. Even today, popular culture continues to present sanitized versions of chimney sweeps that bear little relationship to the historical reality of systematic child torture. The economic calculations that sustained this system of exploitation were complex and sophisticated, involving detailed analysis of costs, benefits, and risks that would have been impressive in any legitimate business context. Masters tracked mortality rates, injury frequencies, and productivity levels with the same precision that other businesses might use to manage inventory or equipment. These calculations revealed the cold logic underlying what appeared to be random cruelty. Every aspect of how children were treated was optimized to maximize economic returns. From the minimal food rations that kept them small enough to navigate narrow chimneys while providing just enough nutrition to sustain work capacity, to the calculated use of punishment and reward systems that maintained compliance while minimizing the costs of supervision. The sophistication of these economic analyses demonstrates that the suffering inflicted on chimney children was not the result of ignorance, desperation, or lack of alternatives. It was the result of careful planning and systematic implementation by people who understood exactly what they were doing and chose to prioritize profits over human welfare. The detailed records maintained by successful masters provide chilling insights into how thoroughly they had reduced children to economic units. Children were evaluated based on their expected productive lifespan, their maintenance costs, their versatility in handling different types of chimneys, and their replacement costs when they became too injured or sick to continue working. These records also reveal the industry's awareness of the moral problems inherent in their practices and their sophisticated strategies for managing public perception and legal risks. Masters carefully documented their compliance with minimal legal requirements while ignoring the spirit of laws intended to protect children. The most revealing aspect of these business records is how they tracked what masters euphemistically called wastage rates. This term, borrowed from manufacturing, referred to the percentage of children who died or became too disabled to work within specific time periods. Masters would calculate these rates by region, by season, and by type of work, using the data to optimize their procurement strategies and pricing models. A typical master's ledger from the 1820s might show wastage rates of 30 to 40% annually, meaning that nearly half of all children in their employ would be dead or permanently disabled within a single year. Rather than viewing these statistics as evidence of a moral catastrophe, masters treated them as routine business metrics that required management rather than elimination. The most successful masters were those who found the optimal balance between minimizing immediate costs and maximizing productive lifespan. They discovered that providing slightly better nutrition could extend a child's working life by several months, more than compensating for the additional food expenses. Similarly, they learned that certain types of medical care, while expensive up front, could keep children working longer and generate greater overall profits. These calculations led to the development of what could only be described as maintenance schedules for human beings. Masters would plan regular interventions designed to extend children's productive capacity, much as other businesses might schedule maintenance for valuable equipment. A child might receive medical treatment for respiratory problems not because the master cared about their suffering, but because the treatment cost less than acquiring and training a replacement. The medical interventions themselves were often as horrific as the conditions they were meant to address. Doctors working with the chimney sweep industry developed treatments specifically designed to keep damaged children functional rather than to restore their health. Children with severe respiratory problems might receive medications that temporarily suppressed symptoms without addressing underlying damage, allowing them to continue working, while their conditions progressively worsened. Children with infected wounds or skin conditions would receive treatments focused on preventing the spread of infection to other children rather than healing the individual patient. The goal was always to maintain workforce stability rather than to provide genuine medical care. The most disturbing medical practices involved deliberate interventions designed to optimize children's bodies for chimney work. Some masters worked with doctors to develop techniques for stunting children's growth, ensuring they would remain small enough to navigate narrow chimneys for as long as possible. These techniques included dietary manipulations, physical restraints, and even surgical procedures that prevented normal skeletal development. Children who showed signs of growing too large for chimney work might have their spines deliberately compressed through the use of weighted harnesses or forced positioning that prevented normal growth. Others might be subjected to nutritional deficiencies, calculated to slow their physical development without immediately threatening their lives. The surgical interventions were the most extreme manifestation of treating children as equipment rather than human beings. Some masters arranged for children to undergo procedures that would increase their flexibility or durability for chimney work. These might include the removal of ribs that interfered with movement through tight spaces, or the deliberate breaking and resetting of bones to create joints that could bend in unnatural directions. The children who survived these procedures often suffered chronic pain and disability that made normal life impossible, even if they eventually escaped from chimney work. They became living testimonies to the lengths masters would go to optimize human bodies for industrial purposes. The psychological conditioning techniques developed by successful masters were equally systematic and devastating. Masters understood that controlling children's minds was even more important than controlling their bodies, as psychological compliance could be maintained with less supervision and at lower cost than physical restraint. The conditioning process typically began with deliberate disorientation designed to break down children's sense of identity and connection to their previous lives. Children would be given new names, forbidden from speaking about their families or past experiences, and isolated from anyone who might remind them of alternative ways of living. Masters would then systematically destroy children's capacity for hope by demonstrating the futility of resistance through carefully orchestrated examples. New children would be forced to witness the punishment of others who had attempted to escape or rebel, learning that defiance led only to increased suffering without any possibility of success. The most effective masters developed elaborate reward systems that created artificial hierarchies among children, encouraging competition and preventing solidarity. Children who demonstrated exceptional compliance might receive marginally better treatment, creating incentives for others to collaborate in the oppression of their peers. These reward systems were designed to be arbitrary and unpredictable, ensuring that children could never develop reliable strategies for improving their situations. A child who received better food for excellent work one day might be punished for the same performance the next day, creating a state of constant anxiety and dependence on the master's approval. The unpredictability was crucial to breaking down children's sense of agency and control. When rewards and punishments bore no consistent relationship to behavior, children learned that their actions had no meaningful impact on their circumstances. This learned helplessness made them psychologically incapable of planning escapes or developing resistance strategies. The social isolation imposed on Chimney children was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of their treatment. Masters understood that children who formed emotional bonds with each other were more likely to attempt collective resistance or mutual aid. They therefore implemented systematic policies designed to prevent meaningful relationships from developing. Children were frequently moved between different masters or work sites, ensuring that any friendships or alliances that began to form would be quickly disrupted. They were forbidden from communicating during work or meals, and were often required to report on each other's conversations or behavior. The few opportunities for interaction that did exist were carefully managed to promote competition rather than cooperation. Masters would announce that the best performing child in a group would receive better treatment, while the worst performer would face additional punishment. This created incentives for children to sabotage each other's work and to view their peers as threats rather than potential allies. The most insidious aspect of this social engineering was how it destroyed children's capacity for normal human relationships. Children who survived chimney work often found themselves unable to form meaningful connections with others, having learned to view all relationships as competitions, where collaboration meant vulnerability and trust meant betrayal. The seasonal rhythms of chimney work created additional opportunities for psychological manipulation. Masters would use the relative quiet of summer months to implement intensive reconditioning programs designed to prepare children for the harsh winter work season ahead. These summer programs were often more psychologically damaging than the actual chimney work, as they gave masters extended periods to focus exclusively on breaking down children's mental resistance. Children might be subjected to weeks of isolation, sensory deprivation, or forced repetition of humiliating tasks designed to reinforce their subordinate status. The anticipation of returning to chimney work created its own form of psychological torture. Children would spend months dreading the approach of winter, knowing that each passing day brought them closer to renewed suffering. This extended period of anxiety often proved more damaging than the actual work itself. Masters deliberately cultivated this anticipatory dread as a control mechanism. Children who spent months in terror of returning to chimneys were more likely to be compliant during the actual work season, as the reality of chimney work became preferable to the anticipation of even worse treatment. The transition periods between seasons were also used for what masters called refresher training, which involved forcing children to practice chimney navigation in artificially challenging conditions. Children might be sent up chimneys that had been deliberately modified to be more difficult or dangerous than normal work conditions, ensuring that actual job sites would seem relatively manageable by comparison. This training regimen served multiple purposes beyond simple skill development. It reinforced children's sense of helplessness by demonstrating that their masters could create even worse conditions than those they normally endured. It also provided masters with opportunities to identify children who were becoming too large or too damaged to continue working effectively. Children who struggled with the training exercises faced immediate consequences, ranging from reduced food rations to outright abandonment. Masters viewed these seasonal evaluations as necessary business practices, comparable to the routine maintenance and replacement of worn-out equipment in other industries. The children who passed these evaluations returned to work with renewed understanding of how precarious their positions were and how easily they could be discarded if they failed to meet expectations. This knowledge made them even more desperate to please their masters and less likely to risk any behavior that might be interpreted as defiance or inadequacy. The geographic expansion of these psychological control techniques accompanied the spread of chimney sweep operations throughout Britain. Masters who established operations in new regions would typically import not just their business methods, but also their approaches to child management and conditioning. This standardization of psychological abuse ensured that children who were transferred between different masters or regions would encounter familiar forms of control that prevented them from adapting to new circumstances or finding opportunities for escape. The consistency of treatment across different operations also prevented children from developing hopes that they might find more humane masters elsewhere. The networking between masters that facilitated this standardization also served to identify and eliminate masters who showed any signs of treating children more humanely. Masters who provided better conditions found themselves excluded from professional associations and denied access to the most profitable contracts. This peer pressure among masters created a race to the bottom in terms of child treatment, as any show of compassion or humanity was viewed as a competitive disadvantage that threatened the entire industry's profitability. The most successful masters were those who demonstrated the greatest ruthlessness in exploiting children, creating powerful incentives for increasingly extreme forms of abuse. The training programs that masters developed for sharing techniques and best practices with each other included detailed instruction in psychological manipulation and control methods. New masters would learn not just the technical aspects of chimney cleaning, but also sophisticated approaches to breaking down children's resistance and maintaining compliance. These training programs were conducted with the same professionalism and attention to detail that characterized legitimate trade education. Masters would share case studies of particularly effective conditioning techniques, analyze the factors that contributed to successful child management, and develop new methods for maximizing productivity while minimizing costs. The casualness with which these discussions of child abuse were conducted reveals how thoroughly the industry had normalized practices that would have been recognized as torture in any other context. Masters spoke about techniques for breaking children's spirits with the same matter-of-fact tone they might use to discuss equipment maintenance or customer service strategies. The documentation of these training programs provides some of the most chilling evidence of how systematic and deliberate the abuse of chimney children actually was. These weren't the random acts of individual sadists, but the carefully developed and professionally transmitted techniques of an entire industry dedicated to extracting maximum value from child suffering. The evolution of these techniques over time shows how masters continuously refined their approaches based on experience and results. Methods that proved less effective at maintaining control were abandoned in favor of innovations that achieved better compliance at lower cost. The industry's approach to child abuse became increasingly sophisticated and efficient as masters learned from each other's experiences. The regional variations in these techniques reflected local cultural and economic conditions, but all shared the same fundamental goal of reducing children to completely compliant tools of production. Masters in different areas might use different specific methods, but the underlying strategy of systematic dehumanization remained constant across all operations. The most successful masters began establishing what could only be described as schools for training other masters in effective child management techniques. These institutions provided intensive instruction in all aspects of running profitable chimney sweep operations, with particular emphasis on the psychological and physical control of child workers. The graduates of these training programs carried standardized approaches to child exploitation throughout Britain, ensuring that the most effective techniques for abuse and control became widely distributed across the entire industry. This systematization of cruelty represented the peak of the industry's development as an organized system of child exploitation. The curriculum of these training institutions reveals the depth of thought and planning that went into optimizing child exploitation. Students learned detailed techniques for evaluating potential child acquisitions, implementing effective conditioning programs, maintaining productivity under various working conditions, and managing the disposal of children who became too damaged to continue working. The clinical approach taken to these subjects demonstrates how completely the industry had divorced itself from normal moral considerations. Students were taught to view children as business assets that required careful management to maximize returns on investment, with no acknowledgement that they were dealing with human beings capable of suffering. The examination systems used to evaluate students in these programs tested their mastery of techniques for inflicting psychological and physical trauma in service of business objectives. Successful completion required demonstrating proficiency in methods for breaking children's spirits, maintaining control through fear and deprivation, and extracting maximum productivity from damaged and dying workers. The graduates of these programs became the most effective and profitable masters in the industry, spreading their techniques throughout Britain and establishing new operations that achieved unprecedented levels of efficiency in converting child suffering into economic returns. Their success created powerful incentives for other masters to adopt similar approaches, accelerating the spread of the most extreme forms of abuse throughout the entire trade. The professional networks that emerged from these training programs created informal systems for sharing intelligence about regulatory threats, public relations challenges, and opportunities for expansion. Masters could coordinate their responses to reform efforts, share strategies for managing public criticism, and collaborate on new techniques for exploitation. These networks also facilitated the development of increasingly sophisticated methods for evading legal restrictions and public oversight. Masters learned to maintain careful documentation that demonstrated technical compliance with regulations while engaging in practices that violated the spirit of protective legislation. The legal strategies developed through these collaborative networks proved remarkably effective at preventing meaningful regulatory reform for decades. Masters learned to exploit loopholes in existing laws, challenge enforcement actions through procedural objections, and lobby for legislation that appeared protective while actually legitimizing continued abuse. The political influence that the industry achieved through coordinated lobbying efforts extended far beyond what might have been expected from what was ostensibly a small trade serving specialized markets. Masters learned to present their interests as aligned with broader economic and social objectives, making opposition to their practices appear economically irresponsible or socially dangerous. The propaganda techniques developed by the industry became increasingly sophisticated as masters learned to manipulate public opinion through carefully crafted messaging that emphasized positive aspects of their operations while minimizing or concealing evidence of abuse. They hired professional writers and speakers who could present compelling arguments for continued use of child labor without directly acknowledging the suffering involved. These propaganda efforts proved remarkably successful at maintaining public support for practices that should have generated universal moral outrage. Even people who witnessed obvious evidence of child abuse could be convinced that intervention would cause more harm than good, or that the children themselves were better off working than facing available alternatives. The success of these manipulation techniques reveals disturbing truths about human psychology and the power of well-crafted messaging to override moral intuitions and empirical evidence. The industry's ability to maintain social acceptance for systematic child torture demonstrates how effectively organized interests can shape public perception when they have sufficient resources and strategic focus. The most chilling aspect of these propaganda campaigns was how they transformed obvious victims into supposed beneficiaries of a benevolent system. Industry publications regularly featured testimonials from masters describing the grateful expressions of children who had been rescued from workhouses and given opportunities to learn valuable trades. These accounts bore no resemblance to the reality of children choking on soot and dying in agony from respiratory diseases. But they provided the moral cover that society needed to continue consuming the industry's services. The testimonials themselves were carefully crafted pieces of fiction, designed to address specific moral objections that critics had raised. When reformers pointed out the high mortality rates among chimney children, industry publications would feature stories of robust, healthy sweeps who had supposedly thrived under their master's care. When activists highlighted the obvious signs of malnutrition and abuse, the industry would produce accounts of well-fed, contented children who sang while they worked. These fabricated narratives were so far removed from reality that they constituted a form of collective delusion. The cheerful, grateful children described in industry propaganda existed nowhere except in the imagination of masters who had convinced themselves that their systematic torture of real children was actually a form of charity. The most insidious element of this propaganda was how it appropriated legitimate concerns about child welfare to defend practices that destroyed children's lives. Masters presented themselves as child welfare advocates who were providing alternatives to starvation and abandonment. They argued that critics who wanted to end child chimney sweeps were actually condemning children to worse fates in workhouses or on the streets. This rhetorical strategy proved devastatingly effective because it contained just enough truth to seem plausible. Workhouses were indeed horrible places, and many children did face starvation if they couldn't find work. But the industry used these genuine problems to justify practices that were far worse than the alternatives they claimed to be preventing. The false choice between chimney work and starvation became a central theme in industry messaging, even though mechanical alternatives to child labour were readily available and being successfully used in other countries. Masters deliberately concealed the existence of these alternatives to maintain the illusion that child exploitation was an unfortunate necessity rather than a profitable choice. The international context became increasingly embarrassing for Britain, as other European nations successfully eliminated child chimney sweeps without experiencing the economic catastrophe that British masters claimed would result from reform. France had banned the practice entirely. Germany had implemented strict age and safety requirements, and even industrializing nations like Belgium had found effective alternatives to child labour in chimney maintenance. But rather than acknowledging the success of these international examples, the British chimney sweep industry doubled down on claims that foreign approaches were unsuitable for British conditions. They argued that British chimneys were uniquely complex. British weather created special challenges, and British property owners had different expectations that could only be met through the continued use of child labour. These arguments became increasingly absurd, as evidence mounted that mechanical cleaning methods worked perfectly well in chimneys identical to those found in Britain. The industry's insistence on the necessity of child labour began to sound less like technical expertise and more like desperate rationalisation of practices that serve no purpose except generating profits from human misery. The technological solutions that existed during this period were not primitive substitutes that provided inferior results. Many of the mechanical cleaning devices available by the 1820s were actually more effective than child labour at removing dangerous soot buildup and identifying structural problems within chimney systems. The brushes and flexible rods used by adult sweeps in other countries could reach areas that children often missed and could apply more consistent pressure to stubborn deposits. The superior effectiveness of mechanical methods created another layer of moral culpability for masters who continued using children. They weren't just choosing child labour because it was cheaper or more convenient. They were choosing inferior cleaning methods that put their customers at greater risk of chimney fires and structural damage, all for the sake of maintaining their exploitative business models. This willingness to compromise customer safety for the sake of preserving access to child labour reveals how thoroughly profit motives had corrupted the industry's professional standards. Masters were willing to provide substandard services that endangered property and lives rather than adopt methods that would eliminate their ability to exploit children. The insurance industry began recognizing this problem by the 1830s, with some companies offering reduced premiums for properties cleaned using mechanical methods rather than child labour. These market incentives should have driven rapid adoption of alternative cleaning techniques, but the chimney sweep industry successfully lobbied for regulations that prevented insurance companies from discriminating based on cleaning methods. The regulatory capture that the industry achieved through lobbying efforts extended into virtually every aspect of government policy that might affect their operations. Masters maintained extensive networks of relationships with local magistrates, parliamentary representatives, and administrative officials who could influence enforcement of existing laws or prevent passage of new restrictions. These relationships were cultivated through a combination of financial incentives, social connections, and ideological alignment around principles of free enterprise and limited government intervention in business practices. Masters became skilled at presenting their interests as aligned with broader conservative principles that many officials already supported for other reasons. The ideological framework that masters used to defend their practices drew heavily on emerging theories of economic liberalism that emphasized the benefits of unrestricted market competition. They argued that government interference with the chimney sweep trade would set dangerous precedents for regulation of other industries, potentially undermining the economic freedom that was driving British prosperity. This economic liberty argument proved particularly effective with officials who were genuinely committed to free market principles, but who had not fully considered the moral implications of applying those principles to industries built on child exploitation. Masters could present themselves as defenders of economic freedom rather than as advocates for child abuse. The philosophical sophistication of these arguments made them difficult to counter without appearing to oppose fundamental principles of economic organization that were gaining widespread acceptance during the early industrial period. Critics found themselves having to develop complex arguments about the proper limits of market freedom, while defenders of child exploitation could rely on simple appeals to established economic doctrines. The success of these ideological arguments in preventing regulatory reform reveals how abstract principles can be manipulated to serve concrete interests that violate the moral foundations underlying those principles. The same economic theories that were supposed to promote human flourishing through market efficiency were being used to justify systematic torture of children for private profit. The religious arguments that masters developed were equally sophisticated and morally bankrupt, drawing on Protestant traditions that emphasized the spiritual value of hard work and the importance of accepting one's station in life. Masters presented chimney work as character-building education that prepared children for productive adult lives while teaching them valuable lessons about perseverance and responsibility. These religious justifications were particularly effective in communities where traditional Christian values remained strong and where suffering was viewed as potentially redemptive when endured with proper spiritual attitude. Masters could present themselves as moral educators who were providing children with opportunities to develop virtues that would serve them throughout their lives. The theological framework that supported these arguments drew selectively from Christian teachings about the value of suffering while ignoring biblical injunctions about protecting the vulnerable and caring for children. Masters became skilled at quoting scripture that supported their positions while avoiding passages that might call their practices into question. The most cynical aspect of these religious arguments was how they transformed obvious cruelty into supposed kindness. Masters claimed that harsh treatment was actually merciful because it prepared children for the difficulties they would inevitably face in adult life. They argued that providing comfortable conditions would be cruel because it would leave children unprepared for the challenges of independent living. This perversion of religious language allowed masters to maintain self-images as moral and charitable people, while engaging in practices that any honest assessment would recognize as fundamentally evil. They convinced themselves that they were serving God by torturing children, creating psychological defenses that made genuine reform seem not just economically threatening, but spiritually wrong. The community leaders who endorsed these religious justifications often did so without examining the actual conditions that children experienced in chimney work. They relied on masters' descriptions of their practices rather than conducting independent investigations, allowing themselves to be deceived by carefully constructed narratives that bore no resemblance to reality. The social pressures that prevented honest examination of chimney sweep operations were particularly strong in smaller communities where masters had established themselves as respectable businessmen and active church members. Community leaders who might have been inclined to investigate reports of abuse found themselves reluctant to challenge people they knew personally and who appeared to be upstanding citizens. This social integration of masters into respectable society created powerful barriers to reform that went beyond simple economic interests. Acknowledging the reality of what masters were doing to children would have required admitting that trusted community members were capable of systematic cruelty, challenging fundamental assumptions about human nature and social relationships. The psychological defenses that communities developed to avoid confronting these uncomfortable truths included increasingly elaborate rationalization of obvious abuse and willful blindness to evidence that contradicted preferred narratives about local institutions and leaders. People who witnessed clear signs of child suffering learned to explain away what they saw, rather than acknowledge implications that would disrupt their understanding of their community and their own moral standing within it. The seasonal rhythms of community life became structured around the assumption that child chimney sweeps would be available when needed, creating practical dependencies that made moral evaluations seem irrelevant or impractical. Homeowners planned their annual cleaning schedules around the availability of child labour, making the exploitation of children seem like a natural part of the social and economic order. These practical dependencies created their own moral momentum, as people who might have opposed child exploitation in principle found themselves participating in systems that required it for basic household maintenance. The gap between abstract moral principles and concrete daily practices allowed people to maintain self-images as ethical individuals while contributing to systematic abuse. The normalization of child exploitation through routine participation proved more powerful than explicit ideological arguments in maintaining social acceptance of the chimney sweep trade. People who regularly hired child sweeps gradually became desensitized to the obvious signs of suffering, learning to see what they needed to see rather than acknowledging the full horror of what was happening in their own homes. The servants and household staff who witnessed chimney work most directly developed elaborate psychological strategies for avoiding moral responsibility for what they observed. They learned to focus on practical concerns like protecting furniture and managing soot cleanup, while ignoring the human suffering unfolding around them. This compartmentalization of attention allowed people to function effectively in situations that should have been morally intolerable. By focusing exclusively on their specific responsibilities and ignoring broader implications, servants could participate in systems of abuse without confronting the moral weight of their participation. The training that household staff received in managing chimney cleaning operations explicitly discouraged emotional engagement with the children performing the work. Servants were taught to treat chimney sweeps as temporary inconveniences to be managed efficiently, rather than as human beings deserving of concern or care. This professional detachment was presented as appropriate workplace behaviour, rather than moral failure, allowing people to participate in child exploitation while maintaining self-respect and social standing. The institutional frameworks that governed household management effectively insulated individual participants from moral accountability for collective outcomes. The economic calculations that household managers made when hiring chimney sweeps reflected the same cold logic that masters used in managing their operations. Servants compared prices and efficiency ratings without considering the human costs of the services they were purchasing, treating child suffering as an externality that didn't factor into their decision-making processes. The accounting systems used by wealthy households track the costs of chimney cleaning services with the same attention to detail used for other routine expenses, creating paper trails that documented participation in child exploitation while completely ignoring its moral dimensions. These records provide chilling evidence of how thoroughly systematic abuse had been integrated into the normal operations of respectable society. The seasonal planning documents that survive from grand estates show how thoroughly property managers had incorporated child exploitation into their annual maintenance schedules. They would coordinate chimney cleaning with other household projects, timing the work to minimize disruption to family activities while maximizing efficiency of service delivery. These planning documents reveal the casual attitude that wealthy families took toward practices that were destroying children's lives. Chimney cleaning was scheduled alongside garden maintenance and furniture repair, with no acknowledgement that one of these services involved systematic torture of human beings, while the others involved routine care of inanimate objects. The correspondence between property managers and chimney sweep masters provides additional insight into how the exploitation was coordinated and sustained. These letters discuss scheduling, pricing, and service quality with the same professional tone used for any other commercial relationship, despite the fact that the services being negotiated involved sending children into life-threatening situations. The most disturbing aspect of this correspondence is how it reveals the extent to which property managers understood exactly what they were purchasing. Letters frequently include specific requests for children of particular sizes or ages, detailed descriptions of challenging chimney configurations that would require exceptional skill or risk-taking, and explicit acknowledgements of the dangers involved in the work. These communications make clear that the people hiring chimney sweeps were not naive about the conditions children faced or the risks they were being asked to take. They were making informed decisions to purchase services that they knew were likely to cause serious injury or death to the children providing those services. The legal documents that formalized these service agreements often included clauses that explicitly transferred responsibility for child safety to the masters providing the services, allowing property owners to obtain the benefits of child exploitation, while avoiding legal liability for its consequences. These contractual arrangements reveal the systematic nature of the moral and legal structures that protected child exploitation. The insurance policies that wealthy property owners maintained during this period typically excluded coverage for accidents involving chimney cleaning operations, reflecting the insurance industry's recognition that these activities involved unusually high risks of injury and death. This exclusion of coverage should have served as a warning about the dangerous nature of the services being purchased, but property owners continued hiring child sweeps despite clear evidence that the work was likely to cause serious harm. The willingness to accept these insurance exclusions reveals how thoroughly property owners had prioritized cost savings over human welfare. They were willing to accept increased legal and financial risks to themselves in order to continue purchasing services that put children's lives in danger. The medical records from this period provide graphic documentation of the injuries and illnesses that resulted from chimney work. But these records were typically treated as private medical information rather than as evidence of systematic abuse that required social intervention. Doctors who treated chimney children often failed to report patterns of injury that clearly indicated systematic mistreatment. The medical profession's failure to advocate for chimney children represents one of the most troubling aspects of how the exploitation was sustained. Doctors who possessed detailed knowledge of the health consequences of chimney work continued to treat individual cases without addressing the systemic problems that were causing predictable patterns of injury and death. The medical training that doctors received during this period included instruction in treating the specific injuries and illnesses associated with chimney work, normalizing these conditions as routine occupational hazards rather than as evidence of child abuse. Medical textbooks described chimney sweeps' cancer and other work-related diseases in clinical terms that obscured their connection to systematic exploitation. The pharmaceutical industry that developed around treating chimney-related injuries created economic incentives for maintaining rather than eliminating the conditions that caused these health problems. Companies that manufactured medicines for treating respiratory diseases and skin conditions had financial interests in continuing practices that generated steady demand for their products. The research that medical professionals conducted on chimney-related diseases focused primarily on treatment rather than prevention, accepting the continued existence of child exploitation as a given, rather than examining the possibility of eliminating the practices that cause predictable patterns of illness and death. The scientific papers that documented the health effects of chimney work were written in technical language that made them inaccessible to general audiences, preventing the broader public from understanding the full medical evidence against continued use of child labour. This specialised knowledge remained confined to professional circles, where it could be ignored or rationalised rather than serving as the basis for public advocacy and reform. The medical conferences where doctors discussed chimney-related diseases treated these conditions as interesting clinical phenomena rather than as evidence of systematic child abuse that required urgent intervention. The professional detachment that characterised these discussions allowed medical experts to study the effects of child exploitation without confronting their moral obligations to prevent it. The medical journals that published research on chimney sweep diseases often included editorial comments that accepted the continued existence of child labour as inevitable, focusing on improved treatment methods rather than elimination of the practices that caused the diseases being studied. This editorial stance reflected the medical profession's integration into economic and social systems that depended on child exploitation. The training programs that prepared doctors to treat chimney-related injuries included instruction in managing the specific types of trauma and disease that resulted from the work, but provided no guidance on recognizing or reporting systematic abuse. Medical education normalized the treatment of obviously abused children as routine clinical practice. The diagnostic categories that doctors used to classify chimney-related illnesses often obscured their connection to workplace abuse, making it difficult for authorities or reformers to track patterns of injury that might have supported arguments for regulatory intervention. Children who died from chimney sweeps cancer were often listed as dying from generic respiratory diseases, while those who suffered traumatic injuries were classified under accident categories that concealed their connection to systematic exploitation. The medical records that survive from this period provide overwhelming evidence of systematic child abuse, but this evidence was fragmented across individual case files that prevented recognition of broader patterns. The medical profession's failure to aggregate and analyze this information represents a lost opportunity to document the full scope of the humanitarian crisis that was unfolding. The pharmaceutical treatments that were developed for chimney-related diseases often provided temporary symptom relief without addressing underlying conditions, allowing children to continue working while their health progressively deteriorated. These treatments served the interests of masters who needed to maintain workforce productivity, rather than the interests of children who needed genuine medical care. The most cynical medical interventions involved procedures designed to optimize children's bodies for continued chimney work, rather than to restore their health. Some doctors developed techniques for treating respiratory diseases that would allow children to continue breathing soot-filled air for extended periods of time periods, prolonging their working lives rather than protecting their health. The surgical procedures that some children underwent were designed to remove obstacles to continued chimney work, rather than to address the underlying causes of their medical problems. Children with severe respiratory damage might undergo operations to improve airflow that would allow them to continue working in conditions that were destroying their lungs. The pain management techniques that doctors developed for treating chimney children focused on enabling continued work rather than promoting healing and recovery. Children were given medications that would allow them to function despite serious injuries, ensuring that masters could continue extracting productivity from damaged workers. The medical profession's complicity in optimizing child exploitation represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of medicine's relationship with vulnerable populations. Doctors who should have been advocating for children's health instead became collaborators in systems designed to extract maximum economic value from child suffering. The ethical frameworks that guided medical practice during this period apparently contained no meaningful protections for children who were being systematically abused by their employers. The medical profession's primary loyalty was to paying customers rather than to vulnerable patients who had no ability to advocate for themselves. The medical research that was conducted on Chimney children often treated them as experimental subjects rather than as patients deserving care and protection. Some studies involved deliberately exposing children to additional risks in order to gather data on the effects of various forms of chimney work, prioritizing scientific knowledge over human welfare. The consent procedures that governed medical research during this period provided no meaningful protection for children who were completely under the control of masters who had economic incentives to participate in studies that might improve workforce productivity. Children had no ability to refuse participation in research that might cause additional harm. The medical innovations that emerged from research on chimney children were often applied to improve the efficiency of child exploitation rather than to protect children's health and safety. Masters used medical knowledge to optimize their operations, implementing changes that would extend children's working lives without improving their quality of life. The public health implications of widespread child exploitation in chimney work extended far beyond the children directly involved. The diseases and injuries associated with chimney work created broader health risks for communities, but public health officials failed to address these problems through regulatory intervention. The environmental health consequences of using child labour in chimney cleaning included increased risks of chimney fires and structural damage that could threaten entire neighbourhoods. The inferior cleaning that resulted from using damaged and dying children instead of proper equipment created genuine public safety hazards that affected everyone living in areas served by the chimney sweep industry. The epidemiological patterns associated with chimney-related diseases should have provided clear evidence of systematic problems requiring regulatory intervention, but public health officials failed to analyse these patterns or advocate for policy changes that might have addressed the underlying causes of predictable health crises. The social infrastructure that supported this systematic exploitation extended into every level of British society, creating an interconnected web of complicity that made meaningful reform seem virtually impossible. Local parish officials who were responsible for child welfare routinely signed documents transferring custody of orphaned children to masters, often without conducting any investigation into the conditions these children would face. These officials received modest fees for each transfer, creating financial incentives that aligned with the master's need for a steady supply of children. The workhouse administrators who served as the primary source of children for the chimney sweep trade developed increasingly efficient systems for identifying and processing children who would be suitable for the work. They maintained detailed records of children's physical characteristics, noting factors like height, weight, and apparent health status that would determine their value to potential masters. Children who showed signs of defiance or intelligence were often flagged as potentially troublesome, while those who appeared passive and compliant were marked as prime candidates for chimney work. The processing of children through these institutional systems resembled nothing so much as a livestock market, with human beings evaluated and sorted based on their potential economic value rather than their individual needs or circumstances. Children would be lined up for inspection by visiting masters, who would examine their hands for calluses, check their teeth for signs of malnutrition, and assess their flexibility by forcing them into cramped positions that mimicked the constraints of chimney work. The bidding processes that determined which children went to which masters were conducted with the same commercial efficiency used in any other commodity market. Masters would negotiate prices based on the children's assessed characteristics, with younger children commanding premium prices due to their greater to navigate narrow flues, while older children were discounted as they approached the age where they would become too large for the most profitable work. The transportation networks that moved children from workhouses to their new masters developed their own specialized infrastructure, including vehicles designed specifically for transporting groups of children over long distances with minimal cost and supervision. These transport systems treated children as cargo rather than passengers, cramming them into spaces barely adequate for their physical needs, while providing no consideration for their psychological welfare. The journey from workhouse to master's establishment often represented the final transition from whatever remained of normal childhood into a world of systematic exploitation. Children who had retained some hope during their time in workhouses quickly learned that their new circumstances were far worse than anything they had previously experienced. The deliberate cruelty of this transition served important psychological purposes for masters, who understood that children who entered their establishments in a state of shock and despair were easier to control than those who retained any sense of dignity or self-worth. The reception procedures that masters use for newly acquired children were designed to complete the process of psychological breakdown that had begun during the acquisition and transportation phases. Children would be stripped of any personal possessions that might remind them of their previous lives, assigned new names that emphasized their function rather than their identity, and subjected to initial training sessions that demonstrated the futility of resistance. The physical examinations that new children underwent were conducted with the same clinical detachment used for evaluating livestock or machinery. Masters would assess each child's suitability for different types of chimney work, noting physical characteristics that would determine their assignment to specific categories of labor. Children with particularly small builds might be designated for the narrowest and most dangerous chimneys, while those with longer limbs might be assigned to deeper flues that required extended reaches. The initial conditioning period that followed these examinations was designed to break down any remaining psychological resistance, while beginning the process of physical adaptation to chime to be forced to practice new work. Children would climb techniques in specially constructed training chimneys that incorporated obstacles and challenges designed to prepare them for the difficulties they would face in actual work situations. The training chimneys that masters constructed for this purpose were often more dangerous than the actual chimneys that children would eventually clean, incorporating sharp projections, unstable surfaces, and artificially narrow passages that forced children to develop techniques for surviving in conditions that would challenge even experienced workers. Children who failed to master these training exercises faced immediate punishment, while those who succeeded were rewarded with slightly less harsh treatment that encouraged continued compliance. The psychological impact of this training process was carefully calculated to destroy children's sense of agency, while creating artificial feelings of accomplishment that could be manipulated to encourage cooperation. Children who successfully completed training exercises were praised for their skill and dedication, creating emotional dependencies on their master's approval that made rebellion seem not just dangerous, but psychologically impossible. The graduation ceremonies that marked children's transition from training to actual work were designed to reinforce their new identities as chimney sweeps, while severing any remaining connections to their previous lives. Children would be presented with their first set of professional tools and work clothing, marking their formal entry into a trade that would almost certainly kill them before they reached adulthood. The tools that children received during these ceremonies were specially designed for their small hands and bodies, representing sophisticated adaptations of adult equipment that had been modified to accommodate the physical limitations of child workers. The brushes were scaled down to sizes that children could manipulate effectively, while the ropes and climbing equipment were calibrated for their reduced weight and strength. The work clothing provided to new chimney sweeps was designed to be durable rather than comfortable, constructed from coarse materials that could withstand the abrasive conditions inside chimneys, while providing minimal protection for the children wearing them. The clothes were deliberately made, the S in dark colours that would concoct stains that would quickly accumulate, creating a uniform appearance that emphasized the children's function rather than their individuality. The symbolic significance of receiving these tools and clothing was not lost on the children, who understood that accepting them represented their formal entry into a world where they would be valued solely for their economic productivity. The ceremonies marking this transition often included speeches by masters emphasizing the opportunities that chimney work provided, while carefully avoiding any mention of the risks and hardships that awaited the new workers. The work assignments that followed these initiation ceremonies were structured to gradually increase the difficulty and danger of the tasks that children performed, allowing them to develop necessary skills while preventing them from becoming overwhelmed by challenges that might trigger panic or rebellion. New workers would begin with relatively simple chimneys before progressing to more complex systems that required advanced techniques and greater physical endurance. The supervision systems that masters implemented for new workers involved pairing inexperienced children with slightly older workers who could provide guidance while serving as examples of successful adaptation to chimney work. These mentoring relationships were carefully managed to prevent the development of genuine emotional bonds that might encourage collective resistance or mutual support. The older children who served as mentors were selected for their demonstrated compliance and their ability to transmit technical knowledge without questioning the fundamental premises of the work they were performing. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to accept their circumstances that they genuinely believed they were helping newcomers by teaching them to survive in conditions that should never have been imposed on any human being. The technical skills that experienced children taught to newcomers included sophisticated techniques for navigating complex chimney systems, methods for avoiding the most dangerous hazards, and strategies for managing the physical and psychological stresses associated with the work. This knowledge was genuinely valuable for survival, but it also served to normalize practices that were fundamentally abusive by presenting them as professional expertise rather than systematic torture. The safety procedures that children learned during their training were designed not to prevent accidents, but to minimize their impact on productivity when they occurred. Children were taught techniques for freeing themselves when they became trapped, methods for signaling for help when they encountered serious problems, and procedures for continuing work despite injuries that would normally require immediate medical attention. The first aid skills that children developed were focused on treating the types of injuries and illnesses that were common in chimney work, allowing them to provide mutual assistance without requiring expensive professional medical care that would reduce masters' profits. Children learned to clean and dress wounds, treat respiratory problems, and manage pain using whatever materials were available in their work environments. The communication systems that children used during their work were designed to coordinate their activities while minimizing the risk that their conversations would be overheard by masters or customers who might object to evidence of their suffering. Children developed coded languages that allowed them to share information about dangerous chimneys, cruel masters, and opportunities for obtaining extra food or rest. The informal networks that developed among chimney children represented their only source of emotional support and practical assistance in circumstances designed to prevent normal human relationships. These networks operated despite masters' efforts to prevent solidarity, creating underground systems of mutual aid that provided children with their only protection against the worst abuses of their profession. The survival strategies that children shared through these networks included techniques for minimizing injuries, methods for obtaining additional food, and ways of avoiding the attention of particularly cruel masters or dangerous customers. This information was literally life-saving for many children, providing them with knowledge that could mean the difference between survival and death in their daily work. The emotional support that children provided to each other through these informal networks was equally important for maintaining their psychological survival in conditions designed to break their spirits. Children who had been completely isolated from normal human relationships found ways to express care and concern for their peers, creating bonds that helped them maintain some vestige of humanity despite their dehumanizing circumstances. The codes of behavior that governed these informal networks reflected the children's understanding that their survival depended on maintaining secrecy about their mutual support systems. Children learned to provide assistance to their peers, without attracting attention from authorities who would punish any evidence of solidarity or collective resistance. The leadership structures that emerged within these networks were based on experience and demonstrated competence rather than formal authority, with the most knowledgeable and capable children naturally assuming responsibility for protecting and guiding their less experienced peers. These leaders risked severe punishment if their activities were discovered, but they continued providing guidance because they understood that the survival of the entire group depended on effective coordination and mutual support. The information sharing that occurred through these networks extended beyond immediate survival concerns to include intelligence about broader conditions in the chimney sweep trade, including news about masters who had died or retired, opportunities for better treatment with different employers, and rumors about potential changes in laws or social attitudes that might affect their circumstances. The hope that children maintained for eventual improvement in their circumstances was sustained primarily through these informal networks, which provided the only source of information suggesting that alternatives to their current suffering might be possible. Children who had lost all personal hope for escape or improvement could still find motivation in the possibility that their efforts might help their peers or future generations of chimney children. The collective memory that these networks preserved included detailed knowledge about children who had died, techniques that had proved successful for survival, and lessons learned from failed escape attempts or resistance efforts. This accumulated wisdom represented the only form of institutional knowledge that served children's interests rather than their masters' profits. The seasonal rhythms that governed chimney work created predictable patterns in the activities and concerns of these informal networks, with different times of year requiring different survival strategies and presenting different opportunities for mutual assistance. Winter months brought increased workloads and greater physical dangers, while summer periods offered opportunities for recovery and planning. The geographic scope of these networks extended across entire regions as children who were transferred between different masters carried information and maintained connections with peers in distant locations. This geographic integration allowed children to share intelligence about conditions in different areas and to maintain emotional connections that transcended the physical boundaries imposed by their masters. The cultural practices that developed within these networks included rituals for mourning deceased friends, ceremonies for welcoming new children into the trade, and traditions for marking significant events in their shared experience of exploitation. These practices help children maintain their humanity and create meaning in circumstances designed to reduce them to mere economic units. The artistic expressions that emerged from these networks included songs, stories, and visual symbols that conveyed shared experiences and emotions in ways that could escape detection by masters who monitored their verbal communications. Children developed sophisticated methods for expressing their inner lives through forms that appeared innocuous to outside observers, while carrying deep meaning for those who shared their circumstances. The resistance activities that occasionally emerged from these networks were typically focused on protecting individual children from immediate dangers rather than challenging the fundamental structures of their exploitation. Children understood that direct confrontation with masters or authorities would result in severe punishment for everyone involved, so their resistance efforts remained covert and limited in scope. The educational functions that these networks served included teaching literacy and numeracy skills that masters deliberately withheld, sharing knowledge about the broader world beyond chimney work, and preserving information about normal human relationships and social structures that children might otherwise never encounter. This informal education helped children maintain their intellectual development, despite systematic efforts to keep them ignorant and dependent. The medical knowledge that circulated through these networks included folk remedies for common ailments, techniques for treating injuries without professional medical care, and information about symptoms that indicated serious health problems requiring immediate attention. Children became skilled at diagnosing and treating conditions that would have challenged trained physicians, developing expertise born of necessity rather than formal education. The psychological support systems that operated within these networks provided children with their only access to normal human emotions like compassion, friendship, and mutual concern. Children who had been systematically deprived of emotional nurturing found ways to provide comfort and encouragement to their peers, creating relationships that sustained their mental health despite overwhelming trauma. The spiritual practices that some children maintained through these networks reflected their need to find meaning and purpose in circumstances that seemed to offer nothing but suffering and death. Children developed personal belief systems that helped them cope with their daily reality while maintaining hope for something better beyond their immediate circumstances. The planning activities that occurred within these networks focused primarily on short-term survival strategies rather than long-term escape plans, as children understood that their circumstances offered little realistic hope for fundamental change. However, the networks did provide forums for sharing information about opportunities that might improve individual situations, such as masters who were known to provide slightly better treatment, or customers who might be sympathetic to children suffering. The collective identity that emerged from participation in these networks helped children maintain their sense of human dignity, despite systematic efforts to dehumanize them. Children who shared the experience of chimney work developed strong bonds based on mutual understanding and shared suffering that provided them with psychological resources for surviving conditions that would otherwise have been completely overwhelming. The legacy of these informal networks extended beyond their immediate practical benefits to include the preservation of testimony about the reality of children's experiences in chimney work. The stories, songs, and memories that children shared with each other created an alternative historical record that contradicted the sanitized accounts provided by masters and their supporters. The documentation that survived from these networks, primarily in the form of oral traditions that were eventually recorded by sympathetic observers, provides some of the most authentic and detailed evidence available about the daily reality of life, as a chimney chillin accounts revealed. These first, the full horror of systematic exploitation in ways that official records and industry propaganda deliberately concealed. The moral witness that these networks provided challenged the comfortable narratives that allowed British society to ignore or rationalize the systematic abuse of children. The authentic voices of chimney children, preserved through their informal communications and collective memory, offered testimony that contradicted every justification that had been developed for their exploitation. The human connections that children maintained through these networks represented their most successful form of resistance against efforts to reduce them to mere economic resources. By caring for each other and maintaining relationships based on genuine human concern, children demonstrated that their humanity could not be completely destroyed regardless of how systematically they were abused. The courage that individual children showed in maintaining these networks despite the severe risks involved revealed the strength of human bonds and the power of solidarity even under the most oppressive circumstances. Children who faced death daily in their work chose to accept additional risks in order to provide support and assistance to their peers, demonstrating moral heroism that stands in stark contrast to the cowardice of the adults who profited from their suffering. So, what finally ended this nightmare? The answer isn't what you might expect. It wasn't a sudden burst of moral outrage or a heroic rescue mission. It was a slow, grinding process that took decades and required reformers to fight every inch of the way against an industry that had perfected the art of exploiting children, while convincing society it was actually helping them. The end came through a combination of technological advancement, changing economic conditions, and the relentless work of activists who refused to accept that child torture was the price of clean chimneys. Mechanical cleaning devices finally became cheap enough and effective enough that even the most profit-obsessed masters couldn't ignore them. New building codes began requiring chimney designs that could actually be cleaned without sending children to their deaths. And slowly, painfully, public opinion began to shift as the true horror of what was happening became impossible to deny. But here's what haunts me most about this story. The child chimney sweeps of industrial England weren't victims of some ancient barbarism from a less enlightened time. They were the products of a modern, sophisticated economic system that deliberately chose to torture children because it was profitable. The same forces that drove the Industrial Revolution, the same principles of efficiency and cost reduction that we celebrate today, created a machine that consumed thousands of young lives. And the techniques used to justify this horror, to make it seem normal and necessary, those haven't disappeared. Today, when we're told that certain forms of exploitation are just the price of progress, when we're asked to accept suffering because the alternatives are supposedly worse, when we're convinced that questioning profitable practices makes us naive idealists who don't understand how the real world works, we're hearing echoes of the same arguments that kept children dying in chimneys for over a century. The child chimney sweeps remind us that civilized society is always just one economic incentive away from barbarism, that ordinary people can become complicit in unimaginable cruelty when it's packaged as necessity, and that the most important question we can ask isn't whether progress requires sacrifice, but who is being sacrificed and who is profiting from their suffering. The children who died in those chimneys deserved better than the society that failed them. They deserved better than the adults who sold them, the masters who tortured them, and the customers who hired them. But most of all, they deserve to be remembered not as statistics or historical curiosities, but as human beings whose lives mattered, whose suffering was real, and whose deaths should never be forgotten. Because if we forget them, if we let their story become just another chapter in history, we make it that much easier for the next generation of children to disappear into whatever dark spaces our modern economy creates for those too small and powerless to fight back.